and bring it in and maybe start thinking about a project you guys might want to work on. So if you want to do a quick smoke simulation, what's nice about this is it's going to set up a material for you, which the material is one of the hardest things to set up for smoke. So make sure you're in Cycles Render, because if you're in Blender Render, it's going to make a totally different material, and then this shortcut won't really work. But if you just have an object, and if I type in quick smoke, what's going to happen is this will start simulating as if this is like a burning ball or something. But to make it more interesting, you can, let's add like a displacement modifier. And I'm going to add some clouds to it. Maybe make the strength stronger. I'll subdivide it. So I added a subdivision surface modifier. And if I change the texture coordinate and the displace to be global, so now as I scale it, it kind of does this weird thing. So I'm going to go ahead like 10 frames and insert a scaling keyframe. I'm going to go back to frame 1 and scale it to 0. The reason I scaled it at 1 here, because once you scale it to 0, you can't really like scale it out anymore. So it's best to like start with your scale of 1, kind of work in reverse. So it's going to poof out, and then right here it'll go back to 0. I just hit S0, enter, and then hit scale. So now we have this thing that kind of poofs out like that. So this is way cooler than just having a sphere, because when I do the smoke, I can have it inherit the velocity of this, so it's kind of like pushing out. And I can even bring this keyframe in a bit so it pushes out even quicker. So it's like a bang, like a... So basically with that object selected, if you just type in quick smoke, what it did was you have your object that's going to be emitting smoke, and it made a domain for you. And fluid and smoke simulations need a domain. It needs to kind of clip, because it can't simulate this whole area of smoke. So you're saying, I'm only going to simulate in here. So now we have like some smoke. And this is just kind of representational of what the smoke will look like. But what's cool about doing quick smoke is if I go into rendered mode, it even rendered out, it made a material that kind of looks crappy, but it's smoke. So let's see if we can tweak some of the settings. So mainly your tweaking is going to be with the domain, but you'll do a little tweaking of your object as well, which is right there. So this little box down here is saying like how high quality our simulation is. And notice the size of this box is like the size of these kind of this stair-steppy. So if I increase the resolution, so go to your physics tab, and we have smoke. It was already chosen. This box was set to domain. It was even given a name, smoke domain, and we have our division set to 32. If I double that, 64, and go back to the beginning, that box just got smaller, which means the boxes of our smoke will be smaller as well. But every time you double this, it gets exponentially longer to basically simulate the smoke or bake the smoke. So a couple things you can do to speed that up. One, just turn on adaptive domain, which means you have a domain and then it's going to make another domain within it and cut out anything it doesn't need. So as the smoke goes up, the domain just kind of follows it. You can also, instead of increasing the divisions of resolution, you can also add smoke high resolution, which will slow it down a little bit. But so it's definitely slower, but it's much. What it's doing is it's basically multiplying this one extra time. So now this becomes a resolution of 128, even though I have it set to divisions of 64. So that's a way to get some extra quality, but you're not spending so much time simulating. Mike, the max you can go is 512. My laptop has never done anything above 256 divisions. I had to simulate that overnight, so it took like 12 hours maybe. just to simulate, not even render. Okay, so we have some smoke, but I wanted it to poof out a bit. So this is where we choose our smoke, the mesh that we had, and we have to have this initial velocity checked. Notice the flow source is from a mesh, but you could also make smoke coming from a particle system. If you had particles like shooting out, you could have those particles be where the smoke is coming from. So we'll have initial velocity, and now it should really like explode out. Maybe. It didn't really, but it definitely gave it a different look. It could just be bringing in that keyframe a bit. So now the change between the scale of 0 and the scale of 1 is shorter. So let's see if that... Sure, that's fine. Another thing, if this was going to be an explosion on the ground, you can just move your domain up to like this point. And now we've like cut off a bunch of that simulation stuff. And I could scale it on everything but the Z axis. So I hit Shift Z. So I was in scale mode and then hit Shift Z. Okay. Okay, so the last thing with smoke is the lighting when you do this quick smoke. So change it to a sun lamp, because this is a good way to get some results quickly to see what your smoke is kind of looking like. You can hide your little sphere. If I just click this eye here, it'll still render it, so click the camera as well. And that's looking fine. But if you go into materials, choose your domain. And here is how like our smoke is being made. It made it for us. I'm gonna unhook these colors so it's like a whiter smoke. And let's darken this world a little bit. The way to brighten up your smoke, though, is if you go into light paths. Right now, volume is not really getting any importance. So if I click that up to 1, it technically let more light pass into that smoke. Yeah. So I would say that's a good starting point for smoke. Volume scatter and volume absorption can give you different colors. If you want to do fire, we can go over that next week. So that was a crash course in smoke. The key is just have an object, type in, make sure you're in cycles, type in quick smoke. And right off the bat, you start getting something. Okay, so for fluids, it's kind of a similar thing. There's a lot of different ways to make fluids, but if I want water spraying out of this ball, I need this object to be, I need to tell a Blender that this object is going to be shooting water out, but I also need a domain to say like where the simulation is going to be. So if you enter wireframe mode by hitting Z, you can like see more easily. So go to your physics, say I want to do a fluid simulation. This box is going to be our domain where the fluid simulation takes place, and this fluid will be an inflow. And if you just go back to frame 1, it should do nothing. Because the quirk with this one, the other ones will just play. The quirk with this one is you have to hit bake. But then you can kind of key through frame by frame and see, like, you can see the water now. The other quirk is this water doesn't look very good because our final resolution is 65, our preview is 45. So if you go to final, you can see what the final resolution will look like. So yeah, it's not looking that cool. But with this object selected, you can choose the inflow velocity. So x is right here, this red axis. And if I do positive x, like 1, and then you have to hit bake again. Now we're seeing it come out here. If you hit smooth shading, it looks better. I'll let you guys figure out the material, but basically just add a glass material. It will look cool. The last little few tips for this that I think are super helpful. In here, the fluid boundary. So the resolution you can increase. Like I never go above 128 just because of my computing power. But if you want to add like little spray of particles, this fluid particles thing is where you generate them. So like right here you would add, but it won't do anything unless you make at least 2 subdivisions, and it doesn't tell you that anywhere. So that's like the trick right here. And if I do 0.03 for generate, we should get some like spray. Or like when it hits the wall, it'll spray. It slowed down a little bit with the 2 subdivisions, but we'll see if it, like right here, there's like a particle that wouldn't have been there. Here's particles right here that wouldn't have been there. And then we'll just keep going. And you can get some kind of neat results. The last thing is like, well, what if you want it going into a cup? Let's see where that was kind of landing. It's kind of landing right here. We'll make a cylinder. And I'm just going to add a solidify modifier to this and then apply it. So this will also be part of the fluid simulation, and we'll call this an obstacle. And I don't think it'll work. So let's rebake. I'm going to turn the subdivisions down. So now the particles won't work. But we rebake it, and it shouldn't go into it. It should, well, let's say it didn't go into it. I've had that happen before, and you're like, why isn't it going in? It's because it might just be calculating like the shell of it. Huh. Let's see. Okay. Okay, well, yeah, that's one way you get it to go into a cup. It seems to work fine. Now, if it's not going into the cup, you would want to switch this to be shell, which means it's calculating like the whole mesh. Or just to be safe, you could set it to both. So now it's calculating like the volume of this mesh as an obstacle and the mesh itself. So, but there's that. Notice wherever the domain was, that's where the boundaries are. So that's just a few tips. And we can go over any problems you guys have.